Hey guys, welcome back to Fiction Flux. Hope you're all doing well. Now let's get into it. The first rule of surviving UA as Izuku Midoriya was simple. Don't get caught. The second rule was harder. Don't care so much about people that the first rule becomes impossible to keep. She broke the second rule on day 3, which meant the first rule was already running out of time. But let's go back, because you cannot understand the unraveling without understanding why the disguise existed in the first place. And why it existed is a story that starts not at UA, but in a hospital waiting room 2 years before, with a doctor, and a conversation that changed everything. The doctor's name was Oda Kenji, and he had kind eyes and the specific careful voice of someone who had learned to deliver difficult information without making it worse. He said, the quirk is manifesting correctly, One for All is settling into her system the way it should. All Might said, good, that's good. The doctor said, yes, but there's a secondary concern. He pulled up records on his screen. He said, I've been reviewing the registration pathway for Miss Midoriya's hero license application. Given the nature of One for All and the documentation trail connected to it, her name is going to flag in systems that we would prefer it not flag in. All Might said, what systems? The doctor said the commission has a list, people connected to the symbol of peace in ways that could make them targets, not heroes, people adjacent to heroes, families, students. He said her name is on it. Long silence. All Might said, what does that mean practically? He said, it means if she enters UA as Midoriya Izumi, daughter of Midoriya & Co., connected through documented channels to Toshinori Yagi, there are people who will know before orientation ends. He said, people we do not want knowing. All Might looked at his hands. He said, what are the options? The doctor opened another file. He said, there is a precedent, not common, but it exists. Students entering hero programs under modified registration for documented safety reasons. Different name, different presentation, long enough for the threat assessment to change before the real identity becomes necessary for licensing purposes. He said, the program runs for 3 years. By year 3, the landscape will be different. All Might said, you're suggesting she enroll as someone else. He said, I'm presenting options, the decision is hers, and yours to support or not support. All Might looked at the records. He said, how different? The doctor said, different enough that the flag doesn't trigger. Different name. The gender presentation modification would be the most effective misdirection because it changes the search parameters significantly. It is not required, but it is the most effective option available. All Might was quiet for a long time. He said, I need to talk to her. She had been sitting in the waiting area outside the consultation room for 40 minutes. She had a notebook. Obviously, she had been writing about the ceiling tiles for 15 minutes because the ceiling tiles were interesting, and because writing about ceiling tiles was better than writing about the specific quality of anxiety that came from being 15 and sitting outside a room where important adults were deciding things about your future. All Might came out. He sat beside her. She looked at him. She said, how bad? He said, not bad, complicated. She said, what's the difference? He said, bad means something went wrong. Complicated means something requires more thought than expected. She said, okay, tell me the complicated thing. He told her. She listened to all of it without interrupting. This was something she did, the complete reception of information before response, the specific discipline of someone who had learned early that the quality of a response was directly related to the completeness of the understanding preceding it. He finished. She was quiet. She said, he's suggesting I go to UA as a boy. All Might said he's presenting it as an option, not a requirement. She said, but the most effective option. He said, according to his assessment, yes. She looked at her notebook. She thought about 15 years of being exactly who she was, not loudly, not with the specific performed authenticity of someone who had decided their identity was a statement, just quietly, consistently, completely herself. The green hair and the freckles and the notebooks and the crying at hero footage and all of it. She thought about the list, the people on it, the what that meant. She said, if I don't do it and someone finds out about One for All. All Might said, the risk is real, I won't minimize it. She said, and if I do it? He said, 3 years, and then the landscape changes and the documentation pathway adjusts, and you complete the license as yourself. She said 3 years of not being myself. He said 3 years of being a modified version of yourself, in presentation, not in anything that actually matters. She thought about that distinction. She said, my mom. He said would know, obviously, and Dr. Oda, and me, that's the full circle of knowledge. She said, nobody at UA. He said, nobody at UA for as long as it holds. She was quiet for a long time. She said, I'm going to think about it. He said, take all the time you need. She said, I'll need a week. She took 6 days. On the 6th day, she called him. She said, I'm going to do it. He said, are you sure? She said, no, but I've been sure of very few things in my life, and I've done most of them anyway. Being unsure doesn't mean being wrong. He said, that's very mature. She said, I've been quirkless for 15 years. I'm familiar with doing things I'm not certain about. He said, what do you need? She said, a name, a registration, a haircut, and someone to practice with so I don't get caught immediately. He said, the haircut. She said, the hair has to change. Obviously, the rest I can manage. She said, also I need to research how boys move differently, because I have watched a lot of hero footage, and there are biomechanical differences that I need to account for. He said, you're going to take notes on this. She said, I already have 4 pages. He said, of course you do. She said, the name, I want to keep Izuku. It works for either, just change the kanji. He said, that's smart. She said, I know. She cut her hair that weekend. Her mother cried. She said, Mom. Her mother said, I know it's necessary. I know it makes sense, I know. She said, Mom. Her mother looked at her. She said, it's just hair. Her mother said, it's not just hair and you know it. She was quiet. She said, no, it's not just hair, but it's also going to grow back. And the rest of it, the actual me that doesn't change, I'm still me in there. I'm going to be me in there the whole time. Her mother held her face in both hands. She said, I know you are. She said, I just want you to know I see you, the actual you, even when nobody else does. She held her mother's hands against her face. She said, I know, Mom. She said, that's enough, that's going to be enough. She believed it when she said it. The name on the enrollment form was Midoriya Izuku. Different kanji, same sound. She stood in front of the mirror the morning of orientation in the uniform they had sent. She had done the research. She had 4 pages of notes on biomechanics, and another 3 on vocal register adjustment, and 2 on the specific social patterns of teenage boys in institutional settings, derived from observation of her previous school environment. She looked at herself. The hair was short now, not dramatically styled, just short the way it had been naturally chaotic but without the length to show the chaos. The uniform fit differently than she had expected, not worse, just differently, the specific unfamiliarity of clothing, designed for a body geometry that was not hers but close enough. She looked at herself for a long time. She said out loud, practicing the register she had been working on, slightly lower, slightly flatter, the specific absence of the vocal warmth she usually produced. She said, my name is Midoriya Izuku, I want to be a hero. She looked at herself. She said it again. She said, that part is true, every word of that part is true. She picked up her bag, 6 notebooks inside it. The 7th was new, she had started it for the UA period specifically. On the first page she had written 1 line. She had written, everything I am is still in here, remember that. She went to school. Orientation was a controlled chaos of extraordinary people trying to assess each other, without appearing to assess each other. She was very good at this assessment. She had been doing it since she was 9 years old, and people had started being complicated, and she had started writing about the complication. She assessed quickly. The boy with the gravity-defying hair and the aggressive confidence radiating off him like heat was going to be the loudest person in the room, and was probably compensating for something, and she filed that under. Interesting, return to later. The girl with the round face and the warm expression was the only person in the room smiling at people she hadn't met yet with something that looked genuine rather than performed, and she filed that under. Careful, this one is dangerous, she might actually be what she looks like. The boy with the ice and fire, half and half, she wrote in her notebook, immediately, had the specific quality of someone who had decided to be in a room without being present in it, and she filed that under. Carrying something enormous will need time. She was in the middle of filing the angry explosion boy under, the compensating one, but with more accuracy and genuine capability than the presentation suggests. When someone sat beside her. Round face, warm expression, up close even more genuine than from across the room. She said, "Hi, I'm Yurako Chako. You're staring at everyone and writing things down. I find that either alarming or interesting, and I've decided interesting." She said this in one breath. She looked at Izuku. She had to start thinking of herself as Izuku in these spaces. Izuku, Izuku, Izuku. She looked at Izuku with the expression of someone who had made a decision about a person in the first 30 seconds and was comfortable with that decision. Izuku said register adjusted, posture adjusted, the specific set of the shoulders she had practiced. She said, "Midoriya Izuku, I notice things." Uraraka said, "What did you notice about me?" Izuku said that you're the only person in this room who is actually glad to be here, instead of just performing gladness about being here. Uraraka stared at her. At him. Izuku caught herself. Him in these spaces, him. Uraraka said, "That's either the most accurate thing anyone has ever said to me, or the weirdest opening to friendship I've ever experienced." Izuku said, "Probably both." Uraraka laughed. It was the full laugh, the unguarded kind. In the middle of UA orientation, surrounded by people who were carefully managing their presentations, she just laughed. Izuku felt something in her chest that was warm and complicated, and which she filed immediately under, dangerous. This one is going to be a problem for the first rule. She was right. The first week was a performance, and she was good at performances. Not because she was naturally deceptive. She was actually quite bad at deception as a general skill. She had been told multiple times throughout her life that her face communicated everything before her mouth caught up. She was good at this specific performance because she had prepared for it completely. 4 pages of biomechanics, 3 pages of vocal register, 2 pages of social patterns. She had done the research the way she did all research, obsessively, thoroughly, with the specific dedication of someone who understood that the quality of preparation determined the quality of outcome. She had prepared. The performance held. She walked with the shoulder set she had practiced. She spoke at the adjusted register. She kept the specific kind of stillness in social situations that teenage boys defaulted to in institutional settings, the absence of the particular expressiveness that she had spent 15 years being and which would have read immediately as wrong. She was good at it. The problem was she was also, always, still her. And she started leaking through the performance on day 4. It was Ada who almost caught it first. Training exercise, they had been partnered for a rescue simulation. She had been running the tactical analysis in her head the way she always ran it, fast, comprehensive, already 3 moves ahead, and she had said something. She had said, the civilian cluster in Sector 3 is going to move left when the second collapse happens because the sound pressure will be higher on the right, and instinct will push them away from high sound. Iida had stopped. He had looked at her. He had said, "How did you know there was going to be a second collapse?" She had said, "The load distribution in the structure. The primary collapse creates a secondary stress point in the northeastern support, basic physics." He had looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone running an assessment. He had said, "That's extraordinarily precise analysis." She had said, "I have notebooks." He had said, "I've noticed the notebooks. How many?" She had said, "We should move. The second collapse is in approximately 40 seconds. The second collapse happened in 37 seconds. Iida had looked at the collapsed structure. He had looked at her. He had said, "I would like to discuss your analytical methodology at length, when time permits." She had said, "I'm free Thursday." She had walked away before he could notice that her voice had slipped slightly at the end of the sentence. Just slightly, just the specific half-register warmth that she kept having to remind herself to suppress. She wrote about it that night. She wrote day 4, first near miss, Iida, vocal register slip at the end of a stressful situation. Note, stress compromises the register maintenance. Need to develop additional management infrastructure for high-stress moments. She wrote, also the analysis was useful. The second collapse timing was accurate. She wrote, also I think Iida is going to be one of the most genuinely decent people I have ever met, and that makes the first rule harder. She wrote, everything in this school makes the first rule harder. Aizawa noticed something on day 8. Not what it was, but something. She saw him notice. She had developed the specific ability to see the moment when someone's assessment of her shifted, the small recalibration that happened when information did not fully align with existing data. She had seen it in teachers her whole life, and she saw it in Aizawa on day 8. He was watching her run drills. She was doing well. One for All was cooperating in the specific way it cooperated when she was focused, and the focus was clean. She was moving the way she had practiced moving. Shoulder set correct, posture correct, the specific quality of forward momentum that she had identified as the dominant movement characteristic to emulate. And then she caught Bakugo taking a hit that was going to land badly. Without thinking, she moved. She got there in time. She redirected the force with a precision that was not about One for All. That was about the specific instinct of someone who had been watching people get hurt for their whole life and had developed the reflex of prevention. She got him clear. He said, "I didn't need that." She said, and this was the slip, this was where the performance had a gap. She said, "I know you didn't need it, I did it anyway." Not "I know," or "my bad," or "yeah, but still." "I know you didn't need it, I did it anyway." The specific cadence of someone who had spent years navigating the exact relationship between what people needed and what was right regardless. Bakugo had stared at her. Then he had turned and walked away because processing things was not his preferred activity. But Aizawa had heard it. She saw him hear it. She filed this under developing problem, acceleration required in preparation of contingency. She wrote 4 pages of contingency planning that night. The contingency planning was not what saved her. What saved her, for as long as it held, was Uraraka. Not intentionally. Uraraka was not protecting the secret. Uraraka did not know the secret. What Uraraka was doing was being exactly what she was, the genuinely warm person in the room who had decided Izuku was interesting and had made that interesting into a daily project. She kept showing up. At breakfast, at the library, at the training ground edges where Izuku went to write between sessions. She showed up with her specific quality of warmth and her full laugh and her complete absence of the social performance that everyone else was running, and she just talked. And here was the problem. Here was the first rule becoming impossible. When Uraraka talked to her, when she was in the full beam of that unguarded warmth, Izuku stopped performing. Not obviously, not completely, but in the small ways that mattered. The register slipped toward natural. The shoulder set relaxed. The specific expressiveness she had been suppressing leaked through in the edges of sentences, and the quality of her laugh and the way she looked at things Uraraka said with the full unguarded reception of someone who was genuinely delighted. Uraraka noticed these moments. She did not classify them correctly, but she noticed them. She said once, "You're different when it's just us." Izuku said, "What do you mean?" She said, "More I don't know, more you, like the you in training is a subset of the actual you." Izuku looked at her. She said very carefully, "Everyone has a public version and a private version." Uraraka said, "Yeah, but yours are further apart than most people's." Long pause. Izuku said, "I have notebooks about it." Uraraka said, "Of course you do." She let it go. Izuku wrote about it that night for 6 pages. The last line was, "She's going to figure it out before anyone else. I know this. I am choosing to continue anyway because the alternative is performing even when it's just us and I find I cannot do that." She underlined, "I find I cannot do that." She added, "This is the first rule failing. I am aware, I am choosing it anyway." The sports festival was where things started to come apart. Not dramatically, not all at once. In the specific way that carefully managed things came apart, at the edges first, the small places where the management was thinnest, and then inward. The individual matches, she had been preparing for them the specific way she prepared for everything, comprehensively, with attention to every variable. She knew her bracket, she knew the likely opponents. She had analysis on everyone in the event. She had not prepared for what winning in front of a national audience would feel like. She had not prepared for how visible winning would make her. She won her first match with One for All at a percentage that made the stadium go quiet in the specific way stadiums went quiet when something exceeded their framework for what they were watching. She had been precise. She had been controlled. She had been everything the preparation had aimed at. She had also been completely, entirely herself. Because in the middle of a match there was no space for the performance. The performance required attention, and the match required all of it, and the two things could not coexist, so the match won, and she moved the way she actually moved, and reacted the way she actually reacted, and the face she made when the match ended was the face she actually made. The camera caught it. The national broadcast caught it. 17 million people watching a sports festival saw a UA student win a match and make a face that was. The forums went active within minutes. Not with the right conclusion, the forums were not there yet, but with the question. The forums said, something is off about Midoriya. The forums said, that expression, what was that expression? The forums said, I can't place it, but there's something about the way that kid moves. The forums were circling. She watched the clips that evening in her dorm room. She wrote, the festival was visible in ways I did not fully anticipate. The performance cannot be maintained at full exertion. I knew this in theory. The data is now empirical. She wrote, I need to talk to All Might. She wrote, I also need to win the next match. She wrote, prioritizing in order. All Might came to find her before she could find him. He sat across from her in a room that was quiet enough for honest conversation. He said, the festival footage. She said, I know. He said, you were yourself out there. She said, I know. He said, that's not a criticism. She said, I know that too. He was quiet. He said, how long do you think the current situation holds? She thought about Uraraka saying you're different when it's just us. She thought about Aizawa on day 8 hearing, I know you didn't need it. She thought about the forums circling with the question they didn't have the answer to yet. She said, not long. He said, what do you want to do? She said, what I've always wanted to do, be a hero, finish the program, get the license. He said, yes, but what do you want to do about the current situation? She looked at her notebook. She said, I've been thinking about this since week 2. She said, I think there are 2 options. The first option is to hold the performance until it fails externally, let someone else determine the moment. She said, the second option is to determine the moment myself. He said, choosing the moment yourself. She said, yes. He said, when? She looked at her notebook. She thought about Uraraka's full laugh. She thought about Iida's Thursday offer. She thought about Todoroki on the roof and Bakugo's surprised face when she moved without being asked and Aizawa's 33 visits. She said, soon. She said, but not yet, there's something I need to do first. He said, what? She said, I need to understand what I'm going to say. When it happens, I've been preparing the performance for 2 years. I haven't prepared for the ending of it. She said, I need to prepare for the ending of it. He said, how long does that take? She said, I'll need a week. She took 5 days. The thing she understood by the end of 5 days was this. The performance had been about protection. The protection had been real, and the reason had been real, and the choice had been made with full information, and she did not regret it. But the protection had also cost something. Not the performance itself. She had managed the performance. What it had cost was the specific thing that happened when you were known, when people had accurate information about who you were and chose to be in your life anyway. She had been known by her mother and All Might and Dr. Oda. Everyone else had known a modified version. And the modified version had people who cared about it. That was the complicated thing. Uraraka cared about Midoriya, Izuku the boy with the notebooks and the intensity, and the I know you didn't need it cadence. Iida cared. Todoroki, in the specific way Todoroki cared about things, cared. Even Bakugo, in the specific way Bakugo cared about anything, had recalibrated around the modified version. When she told them, they were going to have to recalibrate again. She did not know what the recalibrated version looked like. She wrote about this for 3 days. On the 3rd day she wrote, I have been afraid that telling them means losing what we have, but what I have is people who care about a modified version, and what I want is people who care about the actual version, and the only way to find out if those are the same people is to tell them. She wrote, this is the most frightening thing I have written in 22 notebooks. She wrote, I'm going to do it anyway. She underlined it. She told Uraraka first. Not because Uraraka was the safest, because Uraraka was the one where it mattered most, and she had learned to do the things that mattered most first, because putting them off made them worse. She found her in the library, her corner, the good light. She sat across from her. She said, I need to tell you something, and before I tell you I need you to know that everything, every conversation and every meal, and every time you showed up and every time you laughed, all of it was real. None of it was the performance. Uraraka looked at her. She said, what performance? Izuku said, Midoriya Izuku is my actual name. The kanji is different, but it's my name. She said, everything else you know about me is true. The notebooks, the analysis, one for all, the caring too much about everything, all of it is true. She said, but I'm not a boy. Silence. Long silence. Uraraka's expression went through several things, not in the dramatic way, in the specific real way that genuine emotional processing looked, the sequential arrival of different understandings, each one requiring a moment before the next could begin. She said, you're. Izuku said, yes. She said, this whole time. Izuku said, yes. She said, the way you were different when it was just us. Izuku said, yes. She said, because the performance was thinner then. Izuku said, yes. Uraraka was quiet. She said, was it hard? Izuku said, yes. She said, are you okay? Izuku said, and this was the moment, this was the thing she had been most afraid of and most hoping for simultaneously. She said, I don't know yet, I'm going to find out. Uraraka reached across the table. She put her hand over Izuku's. She said, okay. Just that. Okay. Izuku looked at the hand over hers. She said, that's it. Uraraka said, what did you expect? She said, I didn't know what to expect. That's why it was the most frightening thing in 22 notebooks. Uraraka said, 22 notebooks of being terrified to tell me. Izuku said, the terror started around week 1. The notebook section on it started in week 2. Uraraka looked at her. She said, I am going to need some time to process everything, all of it, what it means and how I feel about all of it. She said, but none of the processing changes the part where I'm your friend. She said, just so you know that up front before the processing happens. Izuku felt something in her chest that arrived completely and without filtering. She wrote about it later. She said none of the processing changes the part where I'm your friend. She wrote, I have been waiting for someone to say something like that for 2 years. She wrote, it sounds exactly like what I needed it to sound like. She underlined it. Aida was next. He processed it with the specific comprehensive honesty of Aida processing anything, completely, out loud, with full acknowledgement of every step of the reasoning. He said, you enrolled under documentation approved for safety reasons. Izuku said, yes. He said, the commission was aware. Izuku said, some of them, the relevant ones. He said, All Might was aware. Izuku said, yes. He said, Aizawa was not. Izuku said, no. He said, he's going to be the hardest. Izuku said, I know. He was quiet for a moment. He said, when you said I know you didn't need it in the training exercise. She said, yes. He said, that was you, not the performance. She said, the performance doesn't survive high-stress situations fully, the real voice comes through. He said, I thought there was something different about that sentence, I couldn't classify it correctly. He said, you're going to tell Aizawa. She said, yes. He said, do you want me to be there? She looked at him. She said, yes, actually, yes. He said, then I'll be there. He stood. He said, Midoriya. She said, yes. He said, thank you for telling me instead of waiting for someone else to figure it out. She said, I needed to determine the moment myself. He said, I understand that. He said, I think you made the right call on the timing. He left. She wrote, Ida immediately offered to be present for the hardest conversation, without being asked, he just offered. She wrote, I have been writing about genuinely decent people since week 1, and I was right about him. She drew a small star. Todoroki, she told on the roof. Because that was where real things happened between them. That was the established location for sentences that went somewhere. She told him directly. He listened. He was quiet for a long time. He said, the roof. She said, yes. He said, you've been coming up here the whole time. She said, yes. He said, and the conversations. She said, all real, every word. He said, when you told me the thing I was carrying wasn't mine. She said, I believed it then, I believe it now, that doesn't change. He looked at the city. He said, you were managing something significant the entire time we were talking. She said, yes. He said, and you still noticed what I was carrying. She said, I notice things. It's what I do. The performance doesn't change what I notice. He was quiet. He said, the carrying something that isn't yours. She said, yes. He said, you understand it from the inside. She said, yes. He turned to look at her. He said, you've been carrying something that wasn't yours either. The modified version. That's not who you are. You've been carrying it for 2 years. She looked at him. She said, yes. He said, you can put it down now. She felt the thing in her chest that arrived completely. She said, working on it. He said, I know. He went back to looking at the city. She wrote that night, Todoroki said you can put it down now, as if it was simple, as if the carrying were the only thing standing between me and not carrying. He is not wrong. He is also not accounting for how long you can carry something before the carrying starts to feel like the natural state, and the not carrying feels like the strange one. She wrote, I am going to need time to figure out the not carrying. She wrote, I have good people to figure it out with. She underlined, good people. Bakugo found out by accident. This was inevitable. She had always known he would find out by accident, because Bakugo did not receive information gracefully when it came through conversation, and the universe had always preferred to give him information through collisions. The collision happened when he walked into the common room at 6 in the morning, and found her sitting on the floor with her back against the couch and notebook 22 open, and she had been awake all night processing the previous 3 conversations, and her defenses were at their thinnest. He said, you're up early. She said, no register adjustment, no shoulder set, just her voice the way it actually was at 6 in the morning after no sleep. She said, I'm always up early. So are you. He stopped. She saw him stop. She looked up at him. He looked at her. She watched the assessment happen in real time. She was familiar with Bakugo's assessments. She had been writing about them since week 1. She knew what his face did when he was processing something that was rewriting an existing category. She said, sit down. He said, what? She said, you're going to be on your feet through the whole thing, and your presence when you're standing is aggressive, even when you're not trying to be aggressive. Sit down. He sat down. She told him. He listened to all of it without saying anything. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. He said the commission approved it. She said, yes. He said, and all might. She said, yes. He said, and you spent 2 years. She said, yes. He said, and you're telling me now. She said, I'm telling everyone now. You happened to be first because you walked in at 6 a.m. He looked at her. He said, the I know you didn't need it thing. She said, that was me, yes. He said, I knew that sentence was wrong. She said, the register slips under stress. He said, it wasn't the register. She looked at him. He said, it was the sentence, the structure of it. Nobody says I know you didn't need it except someone who has been reading people for a long time and knows exactly what each person needs and responds to the full version instead of the surface version. He said, I noticed that on day 4. She said, and you didn't say anything. He said, I didn't have the right category for it. She said, and now? He looked at her for a long time. He said, now I have the right category. He said, it doesn't change the assessment. She said, what was the assessment? He said, that you're the most annoyingly perceptive person in this school, and you see things nobody asked you to see, and you write about all of it, and you care too much about everyone, and it's genuinely irritating. She looked at him. She said, that's the same assessment. He said, I said it doesn't change. She wrote about it that night. She wrote, Bakugo said the assessment doesn't change, and the assessment was that I'm annoying and perceptive, and I care too much. She wrote, I think that was the most Bakugo compliment that has ever existed. She drew 2 stars. Aizawa was last. She had been right that he was the hardest. Not because he was cruel, the opposite, because he was the one who had the most standing to be genuinely upset, whose professional responsibility intersected with her personal situation in ways that the others did not. She found him on the roof. She said, I need to tell you something, as a student telling a teacher, not as someone confessing, as someone giving you information you deserve to have. He said, okay. She told him everything. The doctor's office, the list, the modified enrollment, the 2 years, the performance and where it held and where it didn't, the sports festival footage and the forums circling, the decision to determine the moment herself, the conversations she had already had. He listened to all of it. She finished. He was quiet for a long time. He said the commission knew. She said the relevant people, yes. He said I was not included in the relevant people. She said no, and I'm sorry for that. Not for the original decision, I stand by the original decision, but you should have been included. You've been my teacher for 2 years and you deserved better information than you had. He said the day 8 incident. She said the register slip. He said I noticed something, I didn't have the right category. She said you wouldn't have had the right category because the category wasn't available to you. He said that bothers me. She said I know. He said not being angry, being accurate. She said I know the difference with you. He was quiet. He said the cases, the situations where you made the right call, the day with Bakugo, the second collapse, all of it. She said yes. He said that was you, the actual you. She said the performance never touched the actual work, the work was always real. He said I know. Long pause. He said 33 times I came to this roof. She looked at him. He said I saw a student who was carrying something I couldn't classify. I came up because I thought being here might help with whatever the carrying was. She said it did. He said I want you to know I would have come anyway. She said I know. He said even with the full information. She said I know that too. He was quiet. He said what happens now, officially. She said I've been in contact with Dr. Oda. The documentation pathway was always designed to adjust when the situation allowed. He's filed the relevant updates with the commission. By end of term, my records will reflect accurately. He said and the license. She said on track. The modification was never supposed to affect the licensing pathway, just the registration during the threat period. He said and the threat period. She said the relevant landscape has changed significantly. That's what Dr. Oda confirmed before I started telling people. He looked at the city. He said you waited until it was safe. She said I waited until it was safe, and then I determined the moment myself. He said good. He said it the way he said good, 2 syllables doing the work of a speech. She wrote about it. She wrote Aizawa said good. In the specific way he says things when they mean more than they sound like. She wrote 33 times he came to the roof. He said he would have come anyway. She wrote I believe him. She wrote this is what I meant when I told my mother that's enough. That's going to be enough. She wrote knowing that the actual version is what people would have chosen. She wrote that's the whole thing, that's everything. She underlined it. The class found out on a Thursday. Not through a dramatic announcement, not through the forums finally arriving at the right answer, through Izuku herself in the classroom before training, with her notebook open and her voice at its natural register, for the first time in front of all of them simultaneously. She stood up. She said, I have something to tell the class. I've already told some of you individually, and this is the rest of you hearing it together. She told them. She was precise. She covered the safety reason, the commission approval, the 2-year timeline, the decision to disclose now. She was exactly as honest as she had been in every individual conversation. She did not perform the disclosure, she just disclosed. When she finished, the classroom was quiet. Then Kaminari said, wait, so the notebooks. She said, always real. He said, and the analysis. She said, always real. He said, and the time you explained to me exactly why my technique was losing 30% efficiency and gave me 4 pages of improvement notes. She said, real, the notes were good, you should implement them. He said, I did implement them. He said, okay. He said, I mean, okay, that's the main thing. Kirishima said, that's extremely manly actually, not the disguise part, the 2 years of managing it and still showing up completely everyday part, that's the manly part. Jiro said, it's not about being manly. Kirishima said, I use manly to mean a quality of character that I respect, I'm working on the vocabulary. Jiro said, I know, I'm just saying. Yaoyorozu said, the analytical notebooks you shared with the class in week 4. Izuku said, yes. She said, those were the most accurate assessments of our collective technique gaps that any of us had produced. She said, none of that changes. Izuku said, no, none of it changes. Todoroki said nothing. He was already looking at the training schedule for the day. He had said everything he needed to say on the roof. Bakugo said nothing either. He had the expression of someone who had already processed this and was done processing and was ready for the next thing. Uraraka said, can I just say something? Everyone looked at her. She said, I've known for a week and I'm still processing some of it, and I think that's okay, and I think everyone processing is okay, and I also think. She looked at Izuku. She said, I think you're still the most interesting person in this room, and I made that decision in the first 30 seconds of knowing you, and it has not changed. Izuku felt the warm thing arrive completely. She said, even knowing everything. Uraraka said, especially knowing everything. The classroom was quiet for a moment. Then Aizawa said, training starts in 8 minutes, process on your own time. Everyone moved. She was on the roof that evening. Not alone, the usual people in the usual spots. The spots had not changed. That was the thing she had been most afraid of, that the spots would change, that the reconfigured version of all of them would require reconfigured geography. The spots had not changed. She wrote, the class knows, the full version, 20 students and 1 teacher, and the specific weight of being seen accurately for the first time in 2 years in this building. She wrote, the spots are the same. She wrote, that's the data point I needed. She looked at the city. She wrote, 2 years of a modified version and the actual version, and figuring out which was which, and today the actual version is the only version in this building, and I am still on this roof, and so are the people who were on this roof before. She wrote, my mother said she saw me, the actual version, even when nobody else did. She wrote, she was right that it was enough. She wrote, she was also right that it was not only enough. She wrote, what comes after enough is this. She wrote, people who choose the actual version. She wrote, that's everything, that's the whole project. She looked at that. She looked at the people on the roof. Uraraka with her full laugh and her hand over Izuku's in the library. Ida, who had offered to be present for the hardest conversation without being asked. Todoroki, who had said you can put it down now like it was simple. Bakugo, who had said the assessment doesn't change, and whose assessment was annoyingly perceptive and caring too much. Aizawa, who had come to the roof 33 times and said he would have come anyway. She wrote, I want to be a hero because I know what it is to need someone to show up for the actual version of you, not the modified version, not the performance, the actual thing. She wrote, I am going to be that hero. She wrote, starting with the actual version of myself. She closed notebook 22. She opened notebook 23. She wrote at the top, from here. She looked at the word. She kept it. She began. And that is the story of Midoriya Izumi, the girl who walked into UA as a modified version of herself and spent 2 years being completely, entirely, irreducibly herself anyway, who kept all the notebooks and all the analysis and all the caring too much, who held the first rule until the first rule became less important than the actual thing, who determined the moment herself, who put it down, who found out the spots were the same. No cap, she was built different from the very first day. And the notebooks proved it. Every single page. Notebook 23 lasted longer than any notebook before it. Not because less was happening, more was happening, more than any previous period she had documentation on. The density of the first 2 years had been high, the performance, the management, the near misses, the conversations that mattered, but it had also been a specific kind of density, the density of containment, of managing what existed in a compressed space. Notebook 23 was different. The density was expansive. Things were taking up the space they actually required instead of the reduced space that the modified version had allocated them. Conversations that would previously have ended at a certain depth were going further. Moments that would previously have required the performance to intervene were just moments. She had more room. She had not known until she had more room how much the compression had been costing. She wrote about this on the first page of Notebook 23. She wrote, compression has a cost that is invisible until the compression ends, like holding your breath. You don't fully feel the effort of it until you breathe out, and the breathing out reveals how much the holding was taking. She wrote, I am breathing out. She wrote, it is taking more time than I expected. She wrote, I think that's correct. The first week after was the adjustment week. Not dramatic. The class was not dramatic about it in the way that classes in stories were dramatic about things. They were 17 and 18-year-olds in the most demanding hero program in Japan who had been through villain attacks and training that pushed them past reasonable limits and a sports festival watched by the entire country. They had context for significant things. They processed, some of them faster than others, some of them in ways she could see clearly through the observation she had been running since week 1, some of them in ways she was learning to see because the observation without the performance overlay was different from the observation with it. Cleaner, she could see them more accurately when she was not simultaneously managing herself. She wrote about this in the first week. She wrote, the observation without the performance is better observation. The attention I was spending on maintaining the modified version was attention I was not spending on understanding what I was seeing. I was less accurate than I thought I was. She wrote, adding corrections to several previous notebook entries. She wrote, Kaminari is smarter than the performance allowed me to see. The underperformance is strategic in specific contexts. I missed that. She wrote, Gyro has been watching me more carefully than I registered. I was not watching her correctly because I was managing something every time she was in proximity. She wrote, I had 17 inaccuracies in my understanding of this class because of the compression. 17 is too many, correcting all of them. She spent 2 days on corrections. Uraraka found her doing the corrections and said, what are you doing? She said, fixing 17 errors in my class analysis. Uraraka said, you have errors. She said, 17. The performance was using attention that should have been going to observation. I was less accurate than I thought. Uraraka said, most people would not fix this immediately. She said, most people are not maintaining 23 notebooks of documentation that require internal accuracy for the system to function. Uraraka said, most people. She said, the system requires accuracy. Inaccuracy compounds. 17 errors left uncorrected become 34 and then 68, and then the documentation stops being useful. Uraraka looked at her. She said, you're correcting your understanding of all of us. She said, based on seeing us without the performance filter. Izuku said, yes. She said, what did you get wrong about me? Izuku was quiet. She said, you can tell me, I want to know. Izuku said, I underestimated how much you were caring about your family's situation. I knew it was present. I had the right category. But the weight of it, how much it was driving your decisions, how much of your training intensity was specifically about that weight, I had that at 60% of what it actually is. Uraraka was very still. She said, how do you know now? Izuku said, you've been different with me this week. More yourself. And the more yourself version makes the carrying more visible, because you're not managing it in front of me the same way. She said, because I know you see me. Izuku said, yes. She said, and knowing you see me makes me not perform the not carrying. Izuku said, yes. Uraraka was quiet for a moment. She said, is it too much, what I'm carrying? Izuku said, no, it's real. Real things are never too much. They're just the accurate weight of the situation. She said, and what do you do with the accurate weight? Izuku said, you write about it, and you let people who can carry some of it with you carry some of it with you. She looked at Izuku. She said, like you. Izuku said, like me, yes. Uraraka said, okay. She said, I'll think about that. She thought about it. She came back 2 days later and she talked about it. Izuku wrote 6 pages. The thing that changed the most was training. Not the technique. The technique had always been real, one for all operating at its honest level, the analysis running clean, the specific precision that came from 15 years of notebooks and preparation. The technique had not been modified. The energy behind the technique had been modified. Some of the output she had been producing in training had been going into the management, the maintenance of the performance under physical stress, the register adjustment during high exertion moments, the shoulder set through exhaustion. A percentage of what she brought to training had been allocated to keeping the performance running. That percentage was now available for the actual work. Aizawa noticed on the 3rd day of post-disclosure training. He did not say anything during the session. He watched with the quality of watching he brought to things he was actively assessing, and he let the session run. After he said, "Your output is up." She said, "I know." He said, "You have more available." She said, "The management overhead is gone. The attention that was maintaining the modified version is available for other things." He said, "How much overhead?" She thought about it. She said, "I estimated 12 to 15% during low-stress situations. In high-stress situations, it was higher because stress compromises the performance, and maintaining it under stress costs more than maintaining it at rest." He said, "You were operating at 85 to 88%. She said, "Approximately, yes." He said, "For 2 years." She said, "Yes." He said, "And you still placed where you placed, performed where you performed." She said, "The notebooks compensate for a lot. Thorough preparation reduces the margin where performance matters." He looked at her. He said, "Midoriya." She said, "Yes." He said, "What you just described is not a 15% improvement in output." She said, "It's not." He said, "What is it?" She said, "The removal of a ceiling I didn't know was there. The performance was a ceiling, not on ability, on function, on what I could access in the moment because the management was using it." She said, "I don't know yet what the full ceiling is without it." He said, "Then we find out." She said, "Yes." He said, "Carefully." She said, "I'm always careful." He said, "I know." He said it the way he said good, short and weighted and doing more work than the word count suggested. She wrote about it. She wrote, "Aizawa said we find out, including himself in the finding out." She wrote, "I think this is what institutional support looks like from the inside, not the commission arrangement, the actual day-to-day kind, the kind where the person responsible for your development decides they are invested in the real version of your development." She wrote, "I had this the whole time without the full version of it." She wrote, "The full version is better." The first time she cried in front of the class was not planned. She had done the crying at the welcome ceremony. That was famous now. The class had found out about the crying at the welcome ceremony during the first week, and it had been received as the most on-brand thing anyone could imagine, and she had been both mortified and unsurprised by this reception. But that was before. That was the modified version navigating the early days. The first time she cried in front of the class, as the actual version, was different. It was in training, a session that had been designed to push them to their limits and had succeeded at that design. She had been working with one for all at the new ceiling, the higher ceiling, the one that existed when the management overhead was gone, and the session had asked everything she had. She had given everything she had. When it was over, she sat on the ground. And she felt something arrive, not exhaustion, not pain, something that came from being completely, entirely deployed, every resource, every capability, every notebook and every hour of preparation and every moment of being exactly herself, all of it having been used for something real. The something felt like relief. The specific relief of someone who has been partially deployed for 2 years and has finally been allowed to be fully deployed and has found out that the full deployment holds. She was full deployment. She was sitting on the ground in the training space, and she felt this, and the feeling was large and arrived completely because she had stopped filtering the large arrivals, and it produced tears. Not sad tears. The other kind. Kirishima saw it first. He said, "Hey, you okay?" She said, "Yes, sorry, I'm okay." He said, "You're crying." She said, "I know, it's the good kind." He said, "There's a good kind." She said, "The kind that happens when something is real, and the realness is too large for the regular container, so it goes somewhere else." He looked at her. He said, "That's the most specific description of crying I have ever heard." She said, "I have notes on it. Notebook 7 has a section." He sat beside her on the training ground floor. He said, "Do you want company or space?" She thought about it. She said, "Company." He said, "Okay." He sat with her. After a few minutes, Uraraka came and sat on the other side. Then Ida, then Todoroki, who sat in the specific Todoroki way that communicated presence without commentary. She sat in the middle of them on the training ground floor and let the good kind of crying finish, and then she breathed out and it was over. She said, "Sorry." Uraraka said, "For what?" She said, "The group situation." Kirishima said, "We chose to sit here." Ida said, "Yes, we were not compelled." Todoroki said nothing, but his being there was the statement. She wrote about it that night. She wrote, "I cried in front of 4 people in the training ground and they sat with me, and nobody made it weird, and nobody required explanation, and nobody performed sympathy." She wrote, "They just sat." She wrote, "I have been writing about genuine decency since week 1, and I keep finding new evidence for the category." She wrote, "The category is robust." She drew 3 stars. The conversation with her mother happened on a weekend visit home. She had been going home every few weeks. Always the same, her mother's cooking and the specific warmth of the apartment, and the tangerine plant on the windowsill that her mother had been tending since she was small. This visit was different. Because she walked in and she was just herself. No transition, no shift from the school version to the home version. The same person she had been all week walking through the door of the place where she had always been that person. Her mother looked at her. She said, "Oh. Just that." Izuku said, "What?" Her mother said, "You look the same but you feel different." She said, "I told them." Her mother said, "I know, you called me that night." She said, "I know, but this is the first time you're seeing it, the difference." Her mother looked at her for a long time. She said, "You look like yourself." Izuku said, "I am myself." Her mother said, "I know, you always were, but now you look like it from the outside too." She said, "The full version." Izuku said, "Yes." Her mother crossed the kitchen and held her face in both hands, the way she had the morning of the haircut. She said, "I told you it would grow back." Izuku looked at her. Her mother smiled. She said, "The hair, I told you it was going to grow back." The hair had been growing back for 2 years. It was not the same as before, shorter still, shaped differently, the specific product of 2 years of different growth, but it was hers again, unambiguously, visibly, completely hers. She said, "It grew back different." Her mother said, "Things usually do." She said, "Is that okay?" Her mother said, "Izumi." The full name, her actual name. Her mother's specific voice saying her actual name in the kitchen of the apartment where she had always been exactly herself. She said, "Everything about you is okay. Everything about you has always been okay. The growing back different is just the accurate record of what the time cost and what grew in its place." She said, "That's allowed to be different." Izuku felt the warmth arrive completely. She said, "Mom." Her mother said, "Yes." She said, "Thank you for seeing me the whole time." Her mother held her face. She said, "Always." She said, "That was never in question." She said, "The only question was always when everyone else would catch up." Izuku wrote about it that night in the apartment, not in the usual notebook, in the one she kept at home, the one that was different from the school notebooks, more personal, less systematic, the one that was just hers without the documentation framework. She wrote, "My mother said the only question was always when everyone else would catch up." She wrote, "They caught up." She wrote, "Not all at once, not perfectly, but they caught up." She wrote, "The spots are the same." She wrote, "That's the whole data set. That's the conclusion the whole experiment was building toward." She wrote, "The actual version is the version people choose." She underlined it twice. Months passed. Not in the summary way of stories that skip the ordinary to get to the significant. The ordinary was the significant. The specific accumulated weight of ordinary days that were ordinary in a new way. The way that ordinary things were ordinary when you were fully present in them, instead of managing a parallel process while experiencing them. She was fully present. It was different from what she had expected. She had expected the full presence to be easier, to feel like relief all the way through. And it was relief. She had written about the relief extensively, the specific quality of the breathing out, but it was also more work in some ways. The full presence meant the full feeling. The things that arrived completely. The training sessions that went well arrived as genuine satisfaction. The sessions that went badly arrived as genuine frustration. The conversations that mattered arrived with their full weight. The moments that were funny were genuinely funny, and the moments that were difficult were genuinely difficult. She was not managing the volume anymore. Everything was at full volume. She wrote about this. She wrote, "The full presence is not always comfortable. The management had a function beyond the performance. The management also regulated how much of everything arrived at once. Without the management, everything arrives at the correct volume, which is sometimes the loud volume. She wrote, I am learning to be in the loud volume. She wrote, I think being in the loud volume is the actual thing. The comfortable thing was the compressed thing, and I am done with the compressed thing. She wrote, adding to the framework, full presence includes full volume is allowed. She underlined, full volume is allowed. The conversation with Bakugo happened in February. Not the roof, not the cafeteria. The hallway outside the training rooms at 7 in the morning, because Bakugo navigated emotional territory through physical proximity to training spaces. She had documented this in week 3, and it remained accurate. He said, the output is up. She said, yes. He said, significantly. She said, the management overhead is gone. Aizawa and I have been working on what the actual ceiling is. He said, and? She said, still finding out. He said, you were at 85%. She said, approximately. He said, and you were still. He stopped. She waited. He said, you were still doing what you were doing, at 85%. She said, yes. He said, for 2 years. She said, yes. He processed this. He said, I've been thinking about that. She said, okay. He said, I've been the most naturally gifted person in most rooms I've been in since I was 4 years old. That's not ego, that's accurate assessment. She said, it's accurate, yes. He said, and you were the person who analyzed my technique better than I did, who moved before I asked for it, who saw things nobody else saw. He said, at 85%. She said, the notebooks compensate for a lot of. He said, that's not what I'm saying. She looked at him. He said, I'm saying I've been using the wrong framework. For what this is, what we're all doing here, I've been running it as a competition with a clear metric, strongest, best, top of the objective measures. He said, and you were operating at 85% of your actual capacity for 2 years, and I was using the full 100% of mine, and the gap between our objective metrics was not what it looked like. He said, because the gap was partially the management overhead. She said, yes. He said, which means the actual gap is different from the measured gap. She said, yes. He said, which means my assessment of where I stand relative to you was inaccurate. She said, I didn't tell you this too. He said, I know why you told me. I'm not processing this as something you did to me. I'm processing it as new data that requires updating the model. He said, I update the model. She said, yes. He said, you frustrate me. She said, I know. He said, because you keep having more than I thought you had. She said, I write things down, the notebooks. He said, it's not the notebooks. She said, what is it? He said, you keep showing up completely, every day, whatever is happening, whatever you're managing or not managing, you show up completely. He said, that's not a skill you can notebook your way to. She looked at him. She said, you show up completely too. He said, I show up loudly, that's different. She said, I don't think it is. He said, explain. She said, loud and complete are not the same, but in your case they happen to both be present. The loudness is visible. The completeness is what I've been writing about since week 3. She said, you have never once shown up as anything other than entirely what you are. That's the whole definition of complete. He was quiet. He said, week 3. She said, the I know you didn't need it incident was day 4. I had a preliminary entry by day 2. The full section started in week 3. He said, you had a section on me by week 3. She said, I had sections on everyone by week 3. Yours was the longest. He said, why? She said, the most data, most visible, most to write about. He said, most complicated. She said, the history, yes. He said, does the section say anything I'd want to know? She thought about it. She thought about everything she had written, the fear that had been converted into aggression, the extraordinary that he was afraid of losing, the complete and entire showing up as himself that she had been documenting for 2 years. She said, it says that you are exactly what you think you are, and also considerably more than that, and the more is what I find most interesting. He looked at her. He said, more how? She said, more in the direction of someone who cares about the right thing, the actual right thing, not the performance of caring about the right thing. The genuine version that sometimes comes out sideways because the sideways is the only channel that feels safe. Long silence. He said, "That's annoyingly accurate." She said, "I know." He said, "I genuinely find you annoying." She said, "I know that too." He said, "In a specific way." She said, "Yes." He said, "The specific way where the annoying is because you're right about things, and being right about things when I wanted to be right about them first is." She said, "Annoying." He said, "Yes." She said, "I have that in the section too." He made the sound. She wrote about it that night. She wrote the most Bakugo conversation that has ever occurred, which is saying something because I have extensive documentation. She wrote, he updated the model. She drew a star. She thought for a moment. She drew 3. The year moved toward its end, the way years moved, with the accumulated weight of everything that had happened becoming the foundation of the next thing. She was on the roof on the last evening. She had been up there for an hour before anyone else arrived. She needed the hour. The hour was for the writing, the specific writing that she did at the end of significant periods, the writing that was not documentation but accounting, the honest record of what the period had been. She wrote for the full hour. She wrote about the disclosure and the adjustment and the corrections to 17 entries, and the training ceiling, and the good kind of crying on the training ground floor, and the full volume arriving completely, and the conversations, and the February hallway, and the visit home. She wrote about being seen. She wrote 2 years of modification and the actual version persisting underneath, 2 years of managing the gap between what I presented and what I was, 2 years of the first rule and the second rule winning in all the ways that mattered, because I could not stop caring about people enough to perform not caring. She wrote, and then the ending, the moment I chose. She wrote, and the spots being the same after. She wrote, that is the data point, that is the conclusion, that is the answer to the question I did not know I was asking from the very first day. She wrote, the question was, is the actual version enough? She wrote, the answer is yes. She wrote, the actual version is what people choose when they have accurate information. She wrote, I am the actual version. She wrote, I am enough. She looked at that last sentence. She looked at it for a long time. She had written many things across 23 notebooks. Tactical analyses and biomechanical observations and ethical frameworks and hero analysis and corrections and the ongoing sections and everything in between. She had not written that sentence before. She wrote it again. She wrote, I am enough. She wrote, not enough for a modified version of myself to be acceptable, not enough in the contingent way of someone who is enough if they perform correctly. She wrote, enough in the actual sense, the foundational sense, the sense that existed before the performance and during the performance and after the performance ended, and which the performance never actually touched because the actual version was always in there, and the actual version had that quality already. She looked at the sentence. She underlined it. Once, because once was enough. She closed notebook 23. She sat in the quiet. Footsteps on the stairs. Uraraka, her spot, the full laugh already present in her expression before she had said anything. Todoroki, his spot, the city-looking posture. Ida, the precise posture that communicated deliberate choice. Bakugo, the wall, arms crossed, present. Aizawa, who came to the roof still, and had stopped counting after 33 because after a certain point, the counting was beside the point. She looked at all of them. The actual versions. In the accurate configuration. She said, I wrote something tonight that I want to read out loud. Nobody said not to. She opened notebook 23 to the last pages. She read, the question was, is the actual version enough? The answer is yes. The actual version is what people choose when they have accurate information. I am the actual version. I am enough. She looked up. The roof was very quiet. Uraraka made a sound that was not quite a word. Ida said, yes, that's accurate. Todoroki said nothing, but his presence on the roof was its own statement, as it always was. Bakugo said, obviously that's accurate. He said it with the specific Bakugo delivery that meant the obviously was not dismissal, but agreement so total that the questioning of it seemed unnecessary. Aizawa said, correct assessment. 2 words, full weight. She looked at all of them. She looked at the city. She felt everything at full volume. The warmth, the specific warm thing that arrived completely now. The relief of the breathing out. The good kind of crying potential, not yet, but present, available. The full volume making room for it if it arrived. The specific quality of being exactly where she was. She picked up her pen. She opened notebook 24. She wrote at the top of the first page, from here. She looked at the word. She added, as myself. She looked at both words. She kept them. She looked at the city and the people on the roof and the summer sky doing its summer thing, and she felt everything that was present arriving at the volume it was actually at. Loud. Real. Hers. She began. And that is the complete story of Midoriya Izumi. The girl who walked in as a modified version and spent 2 years being entirely herself anyway, who kept all the notebooks and all the caring and all the second rule breaking even when the first rule required the opposite, who chose the moment, who put it down, who found out the spots were the same. Who wrote I am enough. And meant it. No cap, she was built different from the very first day. And 24 notebooks proved it. Every single page. If you made it to the very end of this complete story, then you are absolutely Fiction Flux family, and we love you for it. Please subscribe and hit that like button and share this video with every anime fan you know, because every single share helps us grow and reach more people who love stories like this one. Drop in the comments what topic you want us to cover next. See you in the next one.